Good evening, traveler. Before you lay your head upon the pillow, allow me to carry you far from your sheets, into the dirt-soaked hay of a world that stank so fiercely, it made the devil himself wrinkle his nose. Tonight, we descend not into the great castles, not into the scented chambers of queens and kings, but down deep, down into the mud-caked boots of the forgotten. The peasants, the workers, the ones who lived and rotted and still somehow loved through the filth. Let's peel back the centuries of sweetened nostalgia and open the raw, festering wound that was the hygiene of medieval peasants. You see, when most speak of the Middle Ages, they speak of honor and hardship, war and wheat fields, simplicity and serenity. But rarely, so very rarely, do they speak of the stench, the crawling, biting, soul-souring stench. Because how do you describe a life where a bath was rarer than a miracle, where lice were more faithful than spouses, and where your own filth became a second skin? Let's begin at dawn, if we can call it that. There were no alarms, no soft chimes of orchestral ambiance. There was the cough of a child who slept too close to a dung heap, the grunt of a pig nudging its way into your sleeping corner, the drip-drip of moisture from a leaking thatch roof directly onto your lice-bitten scalp. The medieval peasant didn't wake up clean, and they certainly didn't go to bed clean, because cleanliness wasn't a goal, it was a fantasy. Soap, a luxury. Hot water, a myth. Privacy, a joke. The very idea of washing daily would have sounded more absurd to them than flying pigs do to us. Peasants didn't just live with filth, they nested in it. They built lives around it. Their straw bedding, if it could be called bedding at all, was stuffed with hay, feces, fleas, and the occasional dead mouse. And yet they slept. Somehow, night after night. Their bodies surrendered to the grime because resistance meant madness. You cannot scream at the mud beneath your nails when mud is all you've ever known. Do you know what their homes were called? Hovels. That word alone should send a chill down your spine. No chimney, no real ventilation, just a hole in the ceiling, and maybe if the wind was feeling merciful, a breeze to push the smoke outward. Otherwise, you breathed it, along with the smells of last night's stew, this morning's manure, and the ever-present rot that clung to damp wood and skin alike. They didn't scrub their floors, because there were no floors, just earth, just dirt. And they didn't mop it, they pissed on it to kill the dust. There was no running water, there was barely standing water. Wells were shared, if they even existed. Rivers, streams, yes, they were used for washing, for drinking, and for dumping every bodily fluid imaginable. And no, not in that order. Imagine cupping your hands to drink, and beside you, someone squats to relieve themselves. That wasn't scandalous. That was Tuesday. You want to know about soap? There was lye soap, sure. Caustic. Brutal. It stripped grease off iron pans and the skin off your bones if you weren't careful. It wasn't a gentle caress of lavender-scented bubbles. It was a war. You battled your own grease and hoped to come out alive. And even then, soap was rare. Many peasants went months, years, without seeing it. Because why waste ashes and animal fat when you barely had bread? Their clothing told its own tale, a tale stitched in sweat, dirt, and despair. One or two tunics, worn until they dissolved into threads. No changing every day, no laundering weekly. Clothes weren't removed for washing. They were removed for burying. They itched, they crawled, and they stank. You think of linen as light and breathable? Not when it hasn't seen water in months. Not when it's layered with your skin oils, mixed with the mud from your chores, and thickened by the blood of blisters that festered untreated. And what of hair? You imagine flowing medieval locks? Try nests. Hair was a home for lice, for fleas, for every crawling creature that found warmth and safety in a peasant's tangled mane. Children were shaved bald not for fashion, but to make it harder for lice to thrive. Yet even that failed, because lice weren't a nuisance. They were part of the ecosystem. You scratched in public, you scratched in bed, you scratched until your skin bled, and then you scratched some more, and still, you lived. Because what was the alternative? Toilets? There were none. Chamber pots were a city luxury. In the countryside, you went where you stood, behind the hut, beside the livestock, sometimes right outside the front door. And in winter, you did it inside, The stench froze in the air like perfume from hell. Latrines, when they existed, were pits in the ground. Covered, if you were lucky. Caved in, if you were not. Children fell in. Sometimes animals. Sometimes the very people digging them. And yet, there was a strange acceptance, a stillness in the filth. They didn't complain of the smell, because they didn't know another. They didn't speak of disease as a consequence of dirt, because they hadn't yet made the connection. They didn't fear germs. They didn't know they existed. Their bodies were riddled with boils, with sores, with skin conditions that today would send us running to specialists. But back then, you endured, because suffering was part of the script. Hygiene wasn't a choice, it was a fantasy. Even childbirth was a dance with death, drenched in dirt. No sterile tables, no clean hands, a midwife with no soap, a floor covered in straw, and a woman screaming into the night. Infection was not a risk, it was an expectation. If the baby survived, they were baptized quickly, often the same day, not out of piety alone, but because the odds of their tiny body surviving past the week were so laughably low. The church, with all its incense and ritual, couldn't mask the scent of a dying child swaddled in rags. And yet somehow there was beauty, hidden deep beneath the layers of grime, in laughter shared over a communal pot of stew, in lullabies sung by mothers who hadn't bathed in months but still rocked their children with tender hands, in the way a boy chased a chicken barefoot through a yard slick with dung, laughing like kings never could. There was life, raw, unfiltered, unapologetic life, the kind we've sterilized out of existence. And so, dear listener, as you lay there tonight, clean sheets under your back, scented lotion on your skin, and not a single flea daring to cross your threshold, remember this. Comfort is a luxury bought by centuries of suffering. Sanitation was not granted by gods, but earned in blood, labor, and unspeakable decay. The peasants did not live in dirt because they wanted to. They lived there because the world gave them no other choice. So, are you ready to go deeper? To peel back more layers? To feel the itch behind your ear that might be just imagination? Or something far more ancient? Let us begin our descent. They say you are what you eat. But in the world of medieval peasants, that phrase cuts deeper than metaphor. It was survival cloaked in decay, dignity buried beneath spoiled bread, and hunger that scraped its nails down the inside of one's ribs and echoed louder than prayer. If you walked into a peasant's home hoping to find a kitchen, you would find instead a blackened hearth, a pot too heavy for one hand to lift, and the ever-present smell of something not quite spoiled, but certainly not fresh, boiling into something edible, or at least forgettable. The peasant did not cook to enjoy, they cooked to not die. And what they ate did not nourish it, delayed the inevitable. And so their food, their daily communion with the filth of the earth, became an act of worship not to God, but to the gnawing ache in their bellies. Bread was the backbone of their diet, but don't mistake that for soft, fluffy loaves. This bread was hard, coarse, blackened by bad grain and tainted with mildew that no eye could see in the dim light of their hovels. It broke teeth, not fed dreams. Often made from rye infested with ergot, a toxic fungus that whispered madness into the minds of those too poor to throw it away. Hallucinations came not from sacred visions, but from breakfast. Imagine chewing through your only meal of the day and then clawing at your own skin as your nerves unravel from within. But you ate it anyway, because hunger doesn't care for sanity. You didn't ask what was in the bread. You thanked the heavens there was bread at all. Meat was a luxury, and when it did appear, it was more foe than friend. Spoiled pork, often green around the edges, hung in dark corners until the smell became a presence in the house. Flies laid eggs that birthed larvae, and those larvae became part of the meal, not out of ignorance, but out of necessity. You scraped them off when you could. When you couldn't, you swallowed. Salt was a preservative, yes, but salt was expensive. So meat rotted, quietly, stubbornly, and was eaten anyway. A pig's head might be boiled with barley, onions, and the regrets of everyone who had already tasted it. A chicken, if stolen or bartered from a neighbor, would be plucked hastily, and often not entirely, so feathers clung to your teeth as you chewed. The concept of food safety was decades of graves away. You didn't ask how long it had sat on the table, because it wasn't a table, it was a slab of wood darkened by grease, scratched by knives, and haunted by the ghosts of meals past. And yet it wasn't just the ingredients, it was the handling. Imagine hands that had just shoveled pig dung mixing porridge without so much as a rinse. Utensils made of wood, never cleaned properly, always damp, always infected with the secrets of yesterday. Spoons were shared among family members and neighbors, tongues touched where fingers had picked scabs, mouths opened to receive what had marinated in the bacteria of 10 different bodies. There was no soap to wash, and certainly no concept of cross-contamination. The knife that gutted a goat was the same blade that sliced your apple, except apples were seasonal, rare, and often already bruised and worm-eaten by the time they reached your mouth. And you welcomed that worm because it meant protein. Insects were part of the meal whether you wanted them or not. Grain stored in sacks attracted weevils, their tiny larvae burrowing into flour, transforming it into a living, breathing thing before it ever touched the fire. You sifted with your hands, you blew gently, you accepted what you couldn't see, you cooked anyway. Meals weren't shared out of joy, but out of ration. A family of 6 might eat from the same bowl, seated on the ground, passing the spoon, hoping for more but expecting less. Children learned early not to ask for seconds. They learned to swallow fast, before the dog or the rats beat them to it. And rats? Oh, they were the uninvited guests of every household, but treated more as neighbors than pests. You didn't scream when you saw one you sighed, because rats were simply part of the architecture. They lived in the thatch, in the walls, beneath the bedding. They ate what you dropped, chewed what you stored, and sometimes bit what you loved. Babies woke crying with rat bites on their fingers. Mothers wept, fathers set traps, but everyone knew the rats would win in the end. Their hunger was equal to yours, but their hygiene was slightly better. Milk was not the creamy white balm you might imagine. It soured quickly in the summer heat, separating into clumps that floated like forgotten promises. Still, you drank it. You had to. It was mixed into porridge, churned into butter if you were lucky, but usually it was warm, slightly off, and left an aftertaste that lingered longer than most songs. Cheese was a possibility, but it wasn't aged with care. It was curdled by time and chance, often stored in cracked pots that reeked of mold and animal musk. Water, as we've said, was a gamble. You never knew if the source had been blessed by rain or poisoned by manure runoff, and even when you thought it was safe, your stomach knew otherwise. So ale became the drink of choice, not because they loved the taste, but because boiling the barley killed what the stream could not. Even children drank ale, because it was safer than what flowed from the earth. Imagine a toddler, not yet able to speak, sipping weak beer instead of milk, their tiny body processing the only thing that didn't kill them in 2 days' time. Drunkenness was common, but not for pleasure. It was an escape, a numbing of the senses, because when everything you touched was dirty and everything you tasted was dangerous, a little dizziness was mercy. Preservation was not science, it was hope. Meat hung from rafters or buried in ash. Vegetables were pickled in brine that grew cloudy with age, and leftovers were reheated until texture vanished. Mold was scraped off, but some grew within, invisible, silent, insidious. Botulism was a stranger, with a gentle touch. It didn't scream, it didn't rot, it simply killed. One day your neighbor was fine. The next day he was stiff, his eyes frozen mid-blink, and everyone blamed a curse. No one blamed the jar, because jars didn't curse, witches did. So the peasant prayed, crossed himself, and went on pickling. Food rotted on plates, but plates didn't matter. Most peasants ate from trenchers, stale pieces of bread that soaked up the mess and were often fed to dogs afterward. If no trencher was used, food was simply scooped from pots with fingers or slurped directly. Cleanliness was secondary to urgency. Hunger ruled, and when hunger waned and bellies bloated from barely enough, the aftermath was worse. Because digestion was not smooth, it was war. Bowel movements came irregularly, painfully, in a symphony of cramps and groans. Constipation could last days. Diarrhea came without warning. And the outhouse, if there was one, was a hole in the yard, buzzing with flies, crawling with worms, and stinking of every meal that had come before. Some preferred the woods. Some squatted near pigsties. And in winter, They did it indoors, into pots, into corners, into whatever space they could clean with straw and shame. The scent never left. It clung to walls, to clothing, to skin. You smelled it on your lover's breath. You tasted it in the air as you slept. It wasn't disgusting, it was daily. Illness followed like a shadow. Foodborne disease was a silent executioner. No one knew its name, only its rhythm. Fever, vomiting, weakness, death. Children went first, then the elderly, then the strong. The community adapted not by fixing it, but by forgetting it. Funerals became routine. Mourning became abbreviated. No time to cry when the firewood ran out and the next meal hadn't yet been found. They didn't ask why they got sick. They asked why they lived so long, and the answer never came. Only more coughing, more bleeding, more bloating bellies and purple limbs. But despite it all, despite every maggot in the meat, every rat in the grain, every sour gulp of questionable water, they found ways to laugh. A joke shared over spoiled stew still counted. A dance in the rain with an empty stomach still lifted spirits. Because the peasant had nothing, not wealth, not health, not hygiene, but they had defiance. They ate what they had, not what they wanted. They lived not in cleanliness, but in memory. And in memory, even the filth becomes tender. The way a mother wiped her child's mouth with the same cloth she used to swat flies. The way a man passed a bowl to his neighbor with a grin, knowing the meal might kill them both, but grateful to share it anyway. And perhaps that is the dirtiest truth of all, not the rats, not the spoiled meat, not the excrement inches from the hearth, but the fact that they endured it all without breaking, that they smiled with missing teeth, sang with bleeding gums, toasted with unwashed hands. And somewhere in that grime was something we have lost, an intimacy with life so raw, so unsanitized, that even death felt less sterile. They say a smile can light up a room, but in the medieval village, a smile could silence one, not from beauty, but from horror. Teeth were not pearls, they were jagged memories of famine and rot, yellowed with smoke and ground down by coarse bread that had more stone than grain. You didn't show your teeth when you laughed. You showed your survival. A mouth was a battlefield, every gum line scarred, every molar a crumbling fortress under siege by decay. Toothbrushes did not exist. Toothpicks were slivers of bone or rough twigs, used not to clean but to dislodge the remnants of a meal so rotten it might have crawled back out. No rinsing, no mint, no ritual of cleanliness. A kiss tasted like old broth and copper. And yet they kissed. Because love does not demand hygiene, it demands nothing but presence. Lovers whispered promises with mouths full of abscesses, and still believed in the sweetness of union. Because what choice did they have? Tooth pain was a constant companion. It throbbed in the cold, roared with each chew, pulsed like a second heart behind the jaw. A single infected tooth could send a fever through the body, and there were no dentists, no anesthesia, only the blacksmith's pliers or the drunk neighbor's grip. Teeth were yanked in barns, on dirt floors, while the patient screamed into rags that smelled of cowhide and last week's sickness. Sometimes the pain was so intense the afflicted slammed their own head against walls, not in madness, but in desperate negotiation with a body that refused to die cleanly. And if the tooth broke and the root stayed, the rot would fester until the jaw itself softened, bone melting like wax under infection's heat. Faces swelled, eyes bulged, necks stiffened. They called it a curse. We now call it sepsis. Either way, death came softly, not with a sword, but with a whisper in the gums. And yet mouths did not exist only to suffer. They gossiped, they sang, they moaned in pleasure. Because despite everything, they loved. Filthy, reckless, overwhelming love. Sex was not clean. It was not sacred. It was not romantic. It was life clawing at the edge of extinction, desperate to replicate before the pox came. Intimacy was a bodily negotiation done in secret corners, behind barns, beneath hay, or in the same beds where livestock slept. Sheets were never changed, bodies were never washed. And so flesh met flesh not in softness but in shared resilience. The scent of sweat, dirt, menstrual blood, and week-old sickness hung in the air like a third partner. and still they pressed their bodies together. Because for a brief moment, even in the stink and the scratching and the shame, they felt alive. Children were not always the result of love. Sometimes they were the product of necessity, sometimes of violence, and too often of coercion from lords who took what they pleased and called it their right. There was no privacy in a peasant's life, none. Every act was witnessed. To bathe, if you ever did, was to strip down in the presence of others, perhaps by a river, while children stared and laughed. To relieve yourself was to squat behind the hut, knowing full well a neighbor might be walking by. Couples had sex with children sleeping beside them, separated by nothing more than a shared blanket and a wish for quiet. Grandmothers gave birth with goats watching. Fathers died of dysentery while their sons stirred soup 2 feet away. And no one looked away not because they lacked shame, but because shame was a luxury that required space, time, and walls. Peasants had none of those. They lived in each other's breath, their stories intermingled like smoke in a windowless room. Menstruation was not spoken of, but it was everywhere. Rags soaked in blood were hung beside cooking cloths. Women bled into hay, into old skirts, into the silence of their own endurance. There were no pads, no tampons, no understanding of the body's cycles beyond whispers passed down from one suffering girl to the next. Cramps were endured in silence, while bread was kneaded. Miscarriages happened in the field, and the women wiped their thighs and kept working. There were no words for postpartum depression, no help for stillbirths, no grief rituals for the child who bled out before they ever cried. Just another day, another loss, another invisible wound buried under the dirt floor. And still, there was community, a brutal, breathless, intrusive kind of togetherness that offered no space but all the presence in the world. You helped your neighbor wash their dead. You shared lice combs. You gossiped while digging graves. The woman who helped birth your baby was the same one who stole your chicken last winter. And you forgave her, because who else would help when the next one came? Life was not clean. It was entangled, moist with spit, and always under scrutiny. But it was life. Somehow, and what of shame? What of the parts of us we hide even from ourselves? The flatulence, the itches, the discharges, the strange growths we dare not name. In the medieval village, there was no hiding. You scratched where you itched, you sniffed what stank, you dealt with your body in full public view. An oozing sore was simply a thing that happened. A lump in the groin, a rash between thighs, these weren't secrets, they were commonalities. Everyone had something, and if you didn't today, you would tomorrow. There was no pretense of purity, no fantasy of perfection, just bodies slowly crumbling under time and toil. Infections festered in the most private places. Yeast, ulcers, boils that burst during sleep. Genital warts and herpes-like sores spread from partner to partner, and the cause was never discussed. There were no clinics, no warnings, just strange smells, odd pains, and the knowledge that love hurt in more ways than one. And yet they returned to it, again and again, because even in pain, the body remembered what it meant to be held. Latrines, when they existed, overflowed, flies circled endlessly. The air around them was thick with ammonia and regret. But the body cared little for conditions. When it needed to purge, it did, and peasants adapted. They carried pots indoors. They used the same rags to clean themselves and their children. They wiped with leaves, moss, or bare hands. The stench lingered, not for an hour, but for generations. Homes passed down from parent to child smelled of the same sorrow, the same stew, the same sickness, and no candle could mask it. Scent became identity. And in all this, laughter still found a way. Jokes about flatulence, songs about unfaithful husbands, and the boils on their backsides. Folk tales about witches who cursed men with endless itching, because if you could laugh at it, you could live with it. And peasants were masters of that art, laughing not to deny the filth, but to transcend it, to make it theirs, to wrap it in melody and toss it to the wind like a gift. There was no mirror to show them what they'd become, just water so murky that your own reflection looked like a stranger. But they didn't need mirrors. Their lives were reflected in the faces of others, equally worn, equally stained, equally enduring. And in that sameness, there was something sacred, something cleaner than soap, more honest than perfume. A shared humanity that did not require purity to be beautiful. So next time you lock a door to find privacy, or hide a pimple with powder, or whisper your symptoms to a sterile room and await a diagnosis written in Latin, remember them, the peasants, the lovers who kissed with rot in their teeth, the mothers who bled in silence, the fathers who dug latrines for sons they buried too soon. They were dirtier than you think, yes, but they were also stronger than you'll ever know. Illness didn't knock in the medieval village. It seeped, like smoke through thatch, like mold behind the walls, like regret through the marrow. It arrived without warning and left when it pleased, if it left at all. And when it came, it did not wear a name. There was no diagnosis, no Latin word whispered in clean rooms. Only symptoms that spoke for themselves, coughs that never stopped, fevers that glazed the eyes like wax, lumps that grew with the weight of silence, blood in places where there should be none. The body became a riddle, and no one had the answer. So they guessed, and they prayed, and they bled. The sick were not isolated. There were no wards, no gloves, no lines drawn between the well and the dying. Illness was democratic. It slept in your bed, sat at your fire, held your child's hand. When one fell ill, everyone inhaled it. And so medicine, if you could call it that, was not about cure. It was about endurance, about pain, about waiting, about surviving just long enough to bury the last one. A fever was not just heat, it was a prophecy. Mothers would place their hands against their child's brow, feel the burning beneath the skin, and know. Not in theory, but in bone. They knew the rhythm of death. They had heard its breath before, watched it creep behind the eyes, watched it tighten the jaw and slacken the limbs. And still they tried. With what they had, which was nothing. A poultice made from crushed onions and stale ale. A cloth soaked in urine and laid across the forehead like a prayer. Boiled herbs picked from the muddy edge of a ditch, whispered over in the dark by someone whose hands still smelled of goat. There was no clean. There was no sure. There was only hope dressed in dirt. Wounds did not stay closed. Skin broke easily when you worked with rusted blades, when you carried stones that bit back, when you slipped and split yourself on the jagged kindness of your own doorway. And once skin broke, the real danger began. Infection wasn't an idea, it was a presence. You saw it in the way a cut turned red, then angry, then soft and oozing. Pus didn't just trickle, it pulsed, as if the wound had found a voice. It smelled of death before death arrived. But even then, you didn't run to a healer, because there was no healer. You picked the wound open yourself. You drained it with the same knife you used to gut the fish. You burned it with a hot coal, screamed into straw as the flesh hissed. You wrapped it in cloth that had never been washed, tied it with twine, and prayed it would dry. If it didn't, you waited for the fever. And if the fever came, you made peace with the idea that your leg might rot off before the moon turned. Gangrene was not exotic. It was familiar. The color, the smell, the way it crawled, not fast, but steady, like something ancient reclaiming its due. But peasants weren't fools. They knew things, not from books, but from pain, from watching their neighbors die, from trying everything twice, from remembering what had killed their mothers. They had remedies, rituals, half-truths that felt like science. They rubbed wounds with cobwebs because someone once healed that way. They boiled nettles to draw out spirits. They sang over cuts and buried blood-soaked rags beneath moonlight, not because they were primitive, but because no one had offered them anything better. The local priest offered prayers, sometimes salt. A wandering herbalist might offer leaves and warnings. A midwife might mutter about heat and bile and devils in the bloodstream. And in the absence of certainty, everything became medicine. Honey for the throat, vinegar for the belly, urine for the eyes. Yes, urine, fresh, warm, your own, or someone else's. It cleansed, they said. It burned. That meant it worked. Leeches were a mercy compared to what came next. Bloodletting wasn't for the sick, it was for the living. A ritual cleansing of the body, done by those who didn't yet know they were dying. A slice to the vein, a bowl to catch what flowed, a prayer to the saints who watched without intervening. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes the weakness that followed was interpreted as peace. But mostly, It just made death quieter. And still, they did it. Because doing nothing was worse. Boils were everywhere. On backs, on thighs, in the groin, beneath the arms. Painful, bulging reminders that the body was losing the war. And when they reached their peak, they begged to be opened. There was no antiseptic, no sterile blade, just a sharp knife, a hot iron, and the bravery to not flinch when the skin burst. Pus poured out in streams. Sometimes it brought relief, sometimes it brought more infection, and sometimes the boil returned with friends. They called it the devil's kiss, a sign that sin had nested in the flesh. And then came the plagues, not the great ones you read about, but the small ones, the constant, gnawing illnesses that lingered like mold. Tuberculosis that painted lips red and filled lungs with rot. Dysentery that turned the world to liquid. Smallpox that pockmarked beauty into memory. Ringworm that circled the skin like cruel jewelry. Children were born and raised among disease, played with coughs, hugged with sores, kissed with tongues that bled. And when the real plagues came, the sweeping ones, the ones that turned whole villages into cemeteries, there was no panic, just silence, the kind of silence that knows its own futility. People did not scream, they dug. And when they were too weak to dig, they waited. There were no doctors, but there were wise women, cunning folk, midwives with herbs in their pockets and secrets in their blood. Some healed, some didn't. Some were praised, others burned. Because in a world where no one understood how disease spread, suspicion spread faster. If a healer cured too many, she was a witch. If she failed, she was cursed. Either way, fire waited. And yet they came to her, limping, sweating, bleeding, asking for salvation wrapped in lavender or sage or poppy. Opium, when it could be found, dulled the pain. Not cured it, but dulled it. Enough to sleep, enough to forget the rot in your belly or the swelling in your joints. And when nothing worked, when every herb and chant and bloodletting failed, there was always fire. Cauterization, the burning away of evil. A knife, a flame, a hand to hold, and a scream that shook the walls. You burned the wound shut, you burned the tumor down, you burned the flesh in hope the soul might stay. And when that didn't work, you died. In silence or in madness. But you died. And yet through it all there was resilience. The kind of strength that doesn't make history books. The strength of a mother who digs a grave with her bare hands and returns home to cook dinner. The strength of a man who limps on one leg, pus leaking from the stump, and still gathers wood for the fire. The strength of a child who loses 5 siblings and still plays in the mud with a stick, laughing like the world isn't broken. Medicine wasn't science, it was love. It was the holding of hands during fever, the sharing of stale broth, the wiping of a forehead with the only clean rag left, the whispering of stories as the breath faded. And when it was over, they didn't bleach the house. They didn't scrub the walls. They laid the dead in the same room where life would continue. Flies buzzed, the body cooled, and someone lit a candle. Not to mask the smell, but to remember. Because in a world where nothing was clean, memory was the only thing that remained unsullied. The body rotted, and no one understood why, so they blamed what they could not see. And in the villages where light came late and death came often, what they could not see was always watching. Behind the trees, inside the fever dreams, in the flickering candle just before it died, there were always eyes. The saints watched, and so did the demons, and so did the dead who hadn't yet learned how to sleep. Hygiene was not a word they knew. Holiness was, and if you could not clean your skin, you could cleanse your soul. That was the trade. That was the gamble. And it was one they played daily, with every ache in the belly, every boil on the thigh, every child who coughed for too long. They turned to something beyond the flesh, because the flesh had betrayed them too many times. They did not ask what bacteria was. They asked which sin they had committed. They didn't search for the source of the sickness in water or food or lice. They searched for it in dreams, in curses, in the cracks of their own morality. If your foot blackened, perhaps you had walked where a witch had bled. If your child died, perhaps your neighbor had spoken something sour under their breath. If your cow stopped giving milk, perhaps a woman with a crooked back had looked at it for too long. Every illness had a story, every stench had a judgment, and every sore was both punishment and warning. The church did not speak of soap, it spoke of salvation. The body would return to dust anyway, so what use was it scrubbing it? The soul was what mattered. The soul had to be kept spotless. And so they cleaned with confession, not water. They bathed in guilt. They washed themselves with prayer until their throats were raw and their sins were named. And still the boils grew. Still the fevers rose. Still the children bled from their eyes, and no holy water could cool them. And when the priests could not explain the suffering, they declared it righteous. Suffering made you closer to God. Pain was purification. If your body stank, it meant your soul was trying to escape the cage. They taught you that the devil loved perfume, that sweet smells were vanity, that too much attention to the flesh was a path to temptation. And so the peasant wore their stench like a badge of virtue. If your feet bled through your shoes, it meant you walked the path of the saints. They carried charms around their necks made of bones and bits of cloth, not to decorate, but to protect. A tooth of a dead child wrapped in ribbon, a bit of wax from a candle that had burned during a burial, the feather of a bird that died on the doorstep. These were their amulets. They meant something, even when nothing worked. Because belief was the only hygiene they could afford. If you couldn't purify your skin, you could at least ward off the filth of unseen forces. You hung crosses made of straw in doorways. You traced symbols in ash across the floor. You whispered your name backward to confuse the spirits that followed you home from the forest. Exorcisms were more common than medicine. You didn't treat an infection, you tried to drive it out. With chants, with herbs smoked over the fire, with screams and salt thrown in every corner of the room. Sometimes the sick were tied to the bed not because they were dangerous, but because their thrashing was seen as the devil resisting the purge. A young girl who shook from fever might find herself pinned by her mother and aunt. A priest shouting Latin into her face while a bucket of cold water was poured over her again and again. And if she died during it, it meant the demon had been too strong. If she survived, they called her reborn. Wells were blessed. Fields were blessed. Even the mud was blessed before you stepped in it. But still the rats came, and still the corpses swelled. So they turned their eyes further upward, to the stars, to the weather, to the way the moonlight hit a puddle. If the wind blew in the wrong direction during childbirth, it meant the placenta would not leave cleanly. If it rained after a funeral, it meant someone else would die before the week ended. Signs were everywhere, not written on scrolls, but carved into the rhythm of daily filth. If your wound festered too fast, it meant your faith was weak. If it healed, you gave thanks, not to the herbs, but to the saint you'd forgotten to pray to last harvest. And then there were the relic splinters of bones said to belong to martyrs, hairs from the heads of long-dead monks, cloths that had supposedly touched the feet of Christ. These were traded, guarded, kissed, cried over. They were not medicine, but they were stronger than medicine. A woman might walk 20 miles on an infected foot to press her lips to a bit of wood held behind glass and limp home believing herself cured. And sometimes she was, because belief is a kind of anesthesia, and hope dulls the pain even when the wound still oozes. Pilgrimages were the soap of the spirit. You walked until your sores cracked and your toenails fell off, and with each step you believed your guilt washed away. You might die on the road. Many did, but that was seen as noble. Better to die unbathed with a prayer on your lips than to live clean but unrepentant. And so the churches became hospitals of the soul. The sick lined up not for healing, but for forgiveness. They confessed through pus. They wept through boils. They knelt with rotting teeth and blackened gums and begged for the smell to be lifted from their bodies, not by scrubbing, but by salvation. But not all turned to light. Some went into the woods, into the shadow, where the old gods still whispered, where trees remembered names that hadn't been spoken in 100 winters. There, among the moss and the stones, you could find women who knew a different kind of cleanliness, one that didn't involve shame, or saints, or sermons. They cleansed with smoke, with blood, with silence. They didn't judge the wound, they kissed it, and that terrified the church, because there was power in healing without guilt. Power in a poultice that worked better than a blessing. And so those women were hunted, blamed, drowned, burned, not because they were wrong, but because they dared to believe that filth was not a sign of sin, only of circumstance. And even as the fires roared beneath their feet, the people still visited them, in secret. At night, they brought their children with rashes that wouldn't fade. They brought their husbands with trembling limbs. They brought offerings, eggs, bread, hair, wine, and asked for help. They did not care if it was holy, only if it worked. Because when your daughter coughs blood into her own hands, and your son hasn't moved in days, and the priest says only to pray harder you will try anything. And all the while, the village continued to rot, quietly, faithfully. Belief plastered over the walls like a second layer of skin, cracked and flaking, but better than nothing. The church bells rang, and no one questioned why the dead still piled high. The hymns were sung, and no one asked why the coughs grew louder. The altars were polished, while the wash basins stayed dry. Because salvation was not about the body, it was about the after. And so the body became disposable, a vessel for sin, a burden to carry until death could relieve it, a dirty, leaking, stinking bag of flesh that held something pure inside. If you could just suffer long enough, maybe it would be released clean. And yet, there was always someone who looked at the wound differently, who didn't flinch when the pus burst, who didn't gasp at the smell, someone who washed your feet not out of ritual, but because they could not bear to see you wince, someone who held your hair back while you vomited, who cleaned your sores with rags boiled in river water, who whispered comfort instead of commandments. They weren't saints, they weren't witches, they were people who still believed the body mattered, and that, perhaps, was the most dangerous belief of all. So in the end, filth was not just dirt. It was doctrine. It was culture. It was the story they told to survive what they could not understand. The stink was not just in the air, it was in the soul. But buried beneath it, beneath the ashes and the fear and the misread omens, was a truth too stubborn to die, that no amount of prayer could stop the bleeding. But sometimes, a hand held tight enough could make it bearable. If you want to know a people, don't look at how they lived, look at how they shat. Not the kings with their perfumed privies and velvet-seated thrones, but the peasants whose lives were measured in piles and pits, in the slow, soft squelch of manure underfoot, in the flies that circled endlessly but never judged. Filth wasn't an accident. It was the architecture, the very design of life for the poor. No walls to separate the sacred from the soiled, no plumbing to carry shame away. The peasant didn't relieve himself in privacy. He did so wherever the smell wasn't yet unbearable, and even that was a temporary comfort. Behind the house, beside the pig pen, sometimes right on the floor if the wind was cruel and the joints were stiff. The earth accepted it all, urine, feces, bile, blood, and gave back a harvest that carried the scent of last season's suffering. There were no toilets, only holes, sometimes not even that. A shallow trench dug hastily between chores, a mound of waste covered with straw. And in winter, when frost bit too hard and snow hid the old latrine, they brought it indoors. A pot, a corner, a shameful silence. The smell clung to everything. It soaked into the wood, the straw, the fabrics that wrapped children to sleep. And no matter how many herbs you hung from the rafters, no matter how much smoke you pushed through the air, the stench remained, not as punishment, but as presence. It was part of the family. The invisible uncle who lingered long after everyone else had eaten. They called it dung, muck, night soil. But names don't soften the reality. You carried your waste in buckets, sometimes with your own hands if no vessel could be spared, and dumped it into pits that frothed with flies and churned with secrets. Those pits were not far from where you cooked, not far from where you buried your babies. Everything shared space, waste, food, grief. And if the pit overflowed, you dug another, and another, until the yard became a map of human failure marked by soft, sinking spots that children were told not to step in, but they always did. And the animals, oh, the animals shared everything. They didn't have their own stalls, not always. Chickens roosted beside sleeping children. Goats shat where dinner was served. A pig's snout might nuzzle into a pile of dung, while the mother breastfed beside it, unbothered, because what else was there to do? Cleanliness required time, tools, and the absence of survival. They had none of those. So they learned to live not just with the stink, but through it, to recognize the differences. Cow dung was rich, earthy. Human waste turned sharp when fever came. Dog feces was oily, and death true. Lingering death smelled like boiled cabbage left in a closed room for days, mixed with the iron taste of blood, and something else you couldn't name, but once smelled, never forgot. Dead things didn't disappear. There were no morgues, no formal removals. When a person died, they were wrapped in what fabric remained, often the same bedding they died in, and laid out while the house waited to reclaim itself. The body bloated quickly. The jaw stiffened, the fingers curled, the eyes opened at odd hours, and the stench announced itself before the priest arrived. If the ground was soft, they dug a grave behind the house. If it was frozen, they waited. A corpse might lie in the corner for days, slowly giving itself back to the air. Children still played, lovers still whispered, soup still boiled, all while the dead began to turn. They burned incense if they had it. If not, they simply endured. And when it wasn't people, it was livestock. Animals died often, disease, injury, childbirth gone wrong. A bloated sheep in the yard was no reason to halt breakfast. A dead pig in the pen was a problem only if it started to attract wolves. They buried what they could. But digging was hard, and the ground was greedy. So sometimes they dragged the carcass to the edge of the woods and let the world take it. The flies came first, then the maggots, then the birds, the foxes, the slow things that crawl. And in the end, only bones remained. Bones and the smell. A smell that floated through the village like a reminder, soft at first, then sharp, then gone. And no one spoke of it, because there would be more, always more. Laundry was rare, water was heavy, soap was cruel, and time was a currency few could afford. So fabric soaked up waste like memory. A child's blanket might bear the stains of birth, of diarrhea, of blood, and still be passed down. Underclothes, when they existed, were changed only when they fell apart. Menstrual cloths were rinsed in the same streams where someone washed a wounded foot, and everything smelled. Not sharply, not in that acid modern way, but deeply. A slow, rich stink, like mold on wet bread. Like breath after a week of bad meat. Like sweat that has wept through 3 winters without rest. And the air itself, let us not forget, the air was a tapestry of odor. Smoke from peat fires mixed with pig excrement, urine mixed with boiled cabbage, sweat clung to walls and bodies and ceilings. Every inhale was a history of what had passed through the house. You learned to breathe through your mouth not because it helped, but because hope is a funny thing. The scent of sex lingered for hours. The scent of fear when someone coughed blood or collapsed suddenly was different. Sharper, you could smell death coming. Some said it smelled like sour milk. Others, like metal. But everyone agreed, it came before the body cooled. Waste wasn't waste. It was reused. Night soil fertilized crops. Ashes mixed with urine became cleaning paste. Animal fat that clung to bones was scraped and smeared on tools. And if you had a fire, and the need was great enough, even the bones of the dead could be used. Ground to dust, mixed into the soil. Death, in all its stink, became utility. Nothing was wasted, not even decay. Children learned early. To wipe with the left hand. To avoid the pit when the sun was high. To step over the dead rat and not cry. To ignore the worms in the dog's stool. To keep quiet when the smell made them gag. Because gags wasted breath. And breath was precious. And yet somehow they kept going. Through summers that turned the air thick with decay. Through winters where frozen waste became ice sculptures of misery. Through springs where the melt released every buried secret into the air. They kept going, because to stop meant to rot, and they had seen enough rot to know its grip. So they moved forward, through the stench, through the squelch, through the flies and the gas and the bones. They even found joy, laughed at farts, named their pigs after saints, told stories of ghosts made from shit and straw who haunted the corners of the outhouse, because humor is the soap of the soul, and the soul needed scrubbing more than the skin ever could. So when you wrinkle your nose at the thought of dirt, Remember, dirt is clean compared to what they lived with, compared to the stew of waste and rot and decay that clung to every breath, every meal, every act of love or grief or birth or death. They lived in it, they breathed it, and still, they dared to dream. Death did not come as a surprise to the medieval peasant. It came as an echo, a sigh, a smell. It lingered long before the final breath, and stayed long after the last word was forgotten. And in a world where cleanliness was a myth and waste was a companion, death didn't shock, it settled, like dust on every surface, like mildew in the corners of every home. They didn't run from it. They didn't avert their gaze. They lived beside it, slept with it, ate in its shadow, because the boundary between the breathing and the rotting was never clean. It was blurred, like smoke in fog, like a whisper over a prayer. And once the soul slipped free, the body was no longer a vessel, it was a problem. A leaking, bloating, foul-smelling urgency that demanded action, even as grief stole the will to act. There were no morgues, no professionals to step in with gloves and plastic. Just family, just neighbors, just hands already calloused from toil, now trembling as they touched cooling flesh. Rigor set in fast. The mouth hung open unless someone closed it. The eyes stared unless someone covered them. But the smell there was no stopping the smell. It came before the body stiffened, a sweetness almost, like fruit left too long in a dark cellar, then sharper, heavier, more humid, like breath from an open wound. They knew it well, too well. And they moved fast, not because they feared the dead, but because they feared what the dead would become. Burial was not ceremony, it was labor. The ground was often too hard, too wet, too frozen, too full of others, already buried shallow. So you dug where you could, behind the house, beside the tree, in the corner of a field, if the priest allowed it. If not, you buried them without blessing, without witness, without words. Just a body wrapped in what little cloth could be spared, lowered into a hole barely deep enough to keep the animals out. And sometimes it didn't. Dogs dug, foxes clawed, bones surfaced after rain, and no one screamed. They simply reburied, if they could, or looked away, if they couldn't. Graves were marked with rocks, with sticks, with nothing. Names vanished with the rot. The only memory that lingered was the scent, the stain on the floor, the quiet in the bed. Some carved crosses. Some didn't. Some whispered songs. Others drank until silence came. There were no funeral parlors, no embalming, just decomposition in real time. And if you were unlucky enough to live with the body for too long because the priest was far, or the road was blocked, you learned what it meant for a human form to collapse in on itself. The belly bloated, then turned green, then black. The tongue swelled, the eyes oozed, the skin blistered and burst. And through it all, the smell grew. Not linearly, not gradually, but exponentially. It became a fog. It entered your clothes, your mouth, your dreams. Flies came. Always. First as scouts, then in swarms. And they didn't wait for burial. They laid eggs in the corners of the mouth, in the folds of the groin, in the softening scalp. And soon the maggots followed. White, writhing, hungry, a second digestion, faster than the earth. And even after the body was gone, they lingered, in corners, in cloth, in your hair. The house could never be fully clean again. Not because of dirt, but because of memory. And the soul, the soul they hoped it had escaped before the body broke. Because if it hadn't, it might still be there. Wandering, angry, lost. So they left candles burning. They covered mirrors. They placed salt on thresholds, iron under pillows, whispered names backwards so the dead wouldn't return. But sometimes they did. Or so it seemed. A creak in the floor, a shadow by the door, the sudden scent of decay when the wind wasn't blowing. And no one dared speak of it, because if you gave voice to a ghost, it might listen, might answer. And the dead should not speak, they should sleep. But cemeteries were full, always full. And not grand cathedrals with marble graves, but yards, forests, meadows with soft ground and shallow pits. The dead were not spaced apart. They were layered, one atop another. Bones shifting in soil, grinding against each other like teeth in a clenched jaw. The rain unearthed old skulls. The plow turned up ribs. Children played beside femurs and didn't flinch, because bones meant someone had lived, and dying wasn't shameful, only being forgotten was. There were grave diggers sometimes, men who worked with hands already immune to stench, who smoked herbs to numb the nose, who drank before and after, who buried strangers and kin alike. But more often, the digging fell to whoever could still stand. A brother, a wife, a daughter, with hands too small for the shovel. And no one cried while digging. They cried after, or not at all. And the ground gave back. Vegetables grew fat above graves. Roots fed on marrow. Flowers bloomed brighter in soil, soaked with sorrow. And no one found this strange. Life needed death. And the cycle was not poetic. It was practical. You could not afford to waste a body's nutrients, even if it felt wrong. Even if you whispered apologies to the worms, there were no coffins unless you had coin, just linen or hay or nothing. Naked burial was not rare, and decomposition was not delayed. Within days, the body caved. Within weeks, only bones. Within months, bones collapsed into dust, and then another body took its place. The grave became a layer cake of grief, and the living slept nearby, sometimes on top, always aware. Plagues changed things. When they came, the rules collapsed. Mass graves, pits the size of barns, bodies dumped with no rights, stacked like firewood. Some still alive when buried. No one checked, no one could. And when the pits filled, they were sealed and left. And the land above was cursed. Even centuries later, grass grows strangely there. Animals avoid it. The air holds a weight, and still they sang. Because singing gave shape to the sorrow. Lullabies for the dead. Songs to keep the ghosts at bay. They stitched grief into melody, and in the absence of soap, they washed their pain in sound. The dead were not hidden, they were folded into stories. A girl who died with roses in her hands became a saint. A boy who drowned in the latrine became a warning. A man who laughed too hard the day before his fever was cursed. Every death became lesson. Every corpse a scripture. They believed in spirits, not vaguely, not symbolically. The dead walked, sometimes to warn, sometimes to punish, sometimes because they had nowhere else to go. And if your door creaked in the night, you left bread out, just in case. Because better to feed the ghost than offend it. Better to smell rot than feel its breath. And even when they rotted, the dead were still loved, still remembered, still visited in dreams. And that, perhaps, is the most human thing of all, that even without baths, without rituals, without clean sheets or proper graves, they still found ways to grieve. To remember, to say goodbye with dirt under their nails and flies in the air. Because hygiene meant nothing if memory remained intact. And memory, in the medieval village, was the only thing clean. By now, the smell should have broken them. The endless slop of rot, the itch of the lice, the slick of old sweat in places too dark to ever dry these things, should have crushed the spirit, should have hollowed out the chest and left behind only motion without meaning. And yet, somehow, they kept laughing. Not always loudly. Sometimes it was just the curl of a cracked lip, the wheeze of mirth from a chest already drowning in phlegm. But it was laughter all the same. Because even when covered in their own waste, even when gnawing on bread that tasted of mildew and regret, even when the world around them was dying, they did not forget how to live. Not truly, not fully, not completely. Something in them always clawed forward. Not toward purity, not toward beauty, but toward presence, toward one more breath. No matter how thick with stench, they stopped noticing the filth, but not because it was gone. It had simply become part of them. Like a scar you no longer see when you look in the mirror. Their noses adapted first, the stench dulled, or perhaps the brain, in a desperate act of mercy, learned how to filter out the worst of it. Then the skin hardened, so that sores became calluses, and lice became background music. and the ache between the shoulders from bending over the same soil day after day simply became a familiar friend. Pain was not a signal of danger, it was a rhythm, and rot was not a threat, it was a neighbor. You could say they were desensitized, that the horror of their hygiene didn't register because they didn't know any better. But it was deeper than that. They knew. Oh, they knew. They knew their breath could turn milk sour. They knew their bodies stank in ways no rain could cleanse. They knew that love meant sharing not only warmth but fleas, and meals meant swallowing not only food but fragments of dirt, straw, blood, and sometimes bugs. But they made peace with it, not because they wanted to, because there was no other way. Because survival does not ask permission. It simply demands surrender. So they surrendered, but not to death. They surrendered to the absurdity of living in a world that never gave them a clean slate. They found poetry in the puddles of their own piss. They carved lullabies into the drone of flies. They held funerals that smelled like dung and still whispered, "I love you," through swollen tongues. They danced with scabbed feet. They made love with oozing sores. They raised children in cribs that rats had chewed through, and still sang those children to sleep with voices so tired they cracked like dry wood. There were moments small, forgettable to history, where they rose above it. A young girl braiding her sister's hair with fingers blackened by labor. An old man sharpening a knife that had cut bread, meat, rope, and maybe once a hand, with the quiet pride of knowing it still worked. A mother wiping her child's nose with the same cloth she used to mop the floor, then tucking that child in with a kiss that defied every warning the modern world would shout. Those were the cleanest moments, not because they lacked filth, but because they were soaked in defiance. This wasn't resilience as the word is used today, marketed, polished, put on mugs and posters. This was raw endurance, the kind that comes when the soul decides it will not yield, even if the skin has long since peeled away. When your body is dying but your will is louder. When you know that everything around you is falling apart and you still choose to build a small corner of joy, even if that joy lasts only until the next cough. You become a kind of creature that the modern world would not recognize. A kind of human that doesn't flinch at the sight of open wounds, that doesn't run from the sound of someone vomiting, that doesn't scream when a rat crawls over their foot in the dark. You learn to share breath with decay and find it strangely intimate. They didn't bathe often, but when they did, it was holy. A stream, not yet fouled. Rainwater collected in a cracked barrel. A stolen moment in summer when the heat made even the lice slow down. They didn't scrub away the weeks. They didn't emerge spotless, but they felt it. That moment when water touched skin and reminded them that underneath the crust of existence, there was still something soft, still something worth rinsing. And even if the soap burned, even if the lye peeled more than it polished, even if they still stank after, they felt different. Not better, just awake. Some shaved their heads to fight lice. Others poured oil on their scalps and wrapped them tight, suffocating the swarm. Some rubbed crushed herbs under their arms, not to smell good, but to mask the scent of the meat they had just butchered. Some chewed mint not for breath, but to forget the taste of yesterday's bile. Their hygiene wasn't absent, it was improvisational. It was a kind of dance with death, where every step was meant to delay the final collapse. They brushed their teeth with ashes and salt. They wiped with leaves and hope. They cleaned wounds with spit, because that was the cleanest liquid they had. And through all this, their bodies kept going, scarred, twisted, broken but moving, because the body, like the spirit, is stubborn. It wants to survive, even when the odds are foul, even when the beds are crawling, even when the nights are cold and the roof is leaking and the child is crying and the meat is spoiled and the air is heavy with the knowledge that you will never truly be clean. You could say they were primitive, that they lived in filth because they knew no better. But that would be a lie told by comfort to preserve its illusion of superiority. Because there is nothing more advanced than learning how to live in a world that refuses to offer you grace. There is no wisdom greater than knowing the taste of rot and still being able to taste joy. No strength greater than holding a body falling apart and still calling it beautiful. They were not dirty because they were weak. They were dirty because they were strong enough to endure what cleanliness could not reach. And when the worst came, when disease swept through, When food ran out, when the rains flooded the latrine and the pigs trampled the fields, they didn't crumble. They cursed. They screamed. They buried their dead. And then they kept going, one foot in front of the other, dragging whatever dignity they had left through the mud and saying, "This is mine. You can't take this from me." Their dignity didn't wear perfume. It wore scars. Their love didn't smell like roses. It smelled like shared breath and shared soup. Their survival wasn't sanitary. It was sacred, because they didn't need to be clean to be human. They just needed to be seen. And maybe that's why we recoil today, not at their hygiene, but at the mirror they hold up. The reminder that underneath all our soap and scent, we are still them, still fighting the stink of decay with a thin veil of civility, still afraid of dying dirty, still hoping someone will love us anyway. They were not less than us. They were the root from which we grew. They gave us life with hands too filthy to hold their own children safely, and yet they held them anyway. They kissed cheeks, streaked with snot and ash, and never turned away. They married in clothes that hadn't been washed in months. They died in beds that would be reused before they were cold. And still, they loved. They learned. They sang. So if you ever think you are too broken, too tired, too covered in the mess of life to matter, remember them. The ones who taught us that worth does not come with cleanliness. It comes with the choice to wake up one more day and face the stench and still smile. To step into a world that never stops decaying and decide, "I'm staying anyway." You've made it this far. Through the grime, through the blood, through the buzzing of flies and the damp corners of that forgotten hut where life clung to itself like mold on bread. You followed the smell all the way to the marrow, and now you're standing in it, not just the filth, but the feeling, that ancient ache that maybe, just maybe, you were never as far from them as you thought. The peasants, the unwashed, the unloved, the unrecorded, and yet they echo, not in words carved on monuments, but in the way your skin crawls at the thought of dirt, in the way your nose wrinkles when you pass something foul, in the way you forget that comfort is a new invention, and that our ancestors lived and died in a world where rot was not the end, it was the beginning. We pretend to be clean now. We scrub, we sanitize, we scent, we separate ourselves from the rawness that made us. But deep down, the stink still scares us. Not because it's foreign, but because it's familiar. Because it reminds us that the line between dignity and decay is thinner than we want to admit. That if the lights went out and the pipes froze and the stores ran dry, we too would squat in corners and bury our waste in the yard and hope the fever breaks before the baby dies. We are not better, just lucky, temporarily. And maybe that's why you're still here, listening, not out of morbid curiosity, but because something in this story feels like a mirror. A mirror smudged with ash and fog, showing you not who you wish to be, but who you already are when the perfume fades. A creature made of needs and aches and hunger and hope. A body that sweats and leaks and rots from the moment it's born. A soul that learns to carry that mess without flinching. So let me ask you, when was the last time you touched someone who hadn't washed? Held them close anyway? When was the last time you heard someone cough and didn't step back? When was the last time you sat in silence with your own body and forgave it for being so terribly, beautifully alive? Because the peasants didn't have that luxury. They didn't step away from the sick. They didn't shame the smell. They didn't hide the bleeding or the breaking. They helped each other through it, with hands already stained, with breath already heavy, with eyes that had seen too much to be surprised by pus or death or childbirth in the dirt. There is a holiness in that, a kind of sacred profanity, a theology of survival where the sermon is written in mud and the choir sings with cracked lips, and the only prayer worth saying is, "Please, just one more day." And they got it. Sometimes. Not always. But enough. Enough to make us. Enough to pass the torch, covered in soot and sweat, and say, "Here, keep going." And we did. We built cities. We built soap. We built walls between the clean and the unclean and forgot that we were once all the same shade of suffering. We made hygiene a virtue and filth a sin. We forgot the stench that raised us, and in doing so, we lost something. Something tender. Something unspeakably human. Because there's truth in filth. Brutal, soft, unfiltered truth. A baby crying through a fever and still reaching for its mother's breast, even as flies land on the wound. A man coughing up blood and still sharpening his scythe for the morning. A woman giving birth in a stall while her husband digs a grave for the last one. These are not statistics. They are sermons, not tragedies. Testaments. And yes, they were disgusting. But not by accident. By design. By necessity. They didn't have the privilege of scented soap or disposable anything. They didn't know germs, but they knew grief. They didn't know sterile, but they knew sacrifice. They weren't worried about impressions. They were busy, not dying. And sometimes, that's enough. Sometimes, that's everything. So if you came here expecting to laugh good, laughter is a way in. If you came to cringe better, cringing means you still feel. But if you came here, and now you find yourself quiet, still, maybe a little undone, that's best. Because now, you carry them. Not as punchlines, not as props, but as people. People who stank, yes, but who also loved, who also tried, who also mattered. Maybe next time you feel unworthy because of the dirt under your nails, or the blemish on your skin, or the odor after a long day, you'll remember them. Maybe you'll hold yourself softer. Maybe you'll see the beauty in what refuses to be pretty. Maybe you'll smell something foul, and instead of recoiling, you'll remember a time not so long ago when that smell meant someone was still alive, still fighting, still here, and maybe, just maybe, you'll look at this world we've scrubbed clean and wonder what it cost, what we sanitized away, what tenderness we bleached from our souls in the name of being presentable, because under all our polish, the rot still waits. And that's not a curse. It's a reminder that we are flesh, that we are flawed, that we are, at our core, both disgusting and divine. So as this story closes, don't look away. Don't clean your hands just yet. Let the feeling stay a little longer. Let it ache. Let it hum in your bones like an old lullaby sung from the back of a plague cart. Let it wrap around you like the smell of something long buried but not forgotten. And when you sleep tonight, if you dream of dirt floors and smoke-stung eyes and the sound of a distant bell tolling over a wet grave, don't be afraid. It's just them saying, thank you for listening